Welcome to What the Paper Said, in which I, Patrick Crozier, skim through the Times from 100 years ago, read some of the articles, and comment on the ones I find interesting. In this episode, the week ending the 20th of May 1923, what people did before satellite TV, someone talks sense on the railways, which will be ignored, the Americans get ready for another civil war, and some fog. But first, the headlines. Last week I mentioned the case of the Irish deportees. What had happened is that the government had rounded up 100 or so individuals it suspected were assisting the rebels in the Irish Civil War, and deported them to the Irish Free State, as it was then known. A test case was brought, and the Court of Appeal declared this illegal. The government appealed to the House of Lords, the highest court in the land, and this has now also been rejected. Luckily for the government, the Irish Free State has agreed to return the deportees, and this has resulted in the release of Art O'Brien, who was the subject of the test case that had been brought. Well, he was released, and then he was immediately rearrested on a charge of, well, it was either seditious treason or treasonous sedition, I'm not quite sure. This has produced another issue, because in those days, ministers of the Crown were personally liable, or it would appear they were personally liable, for cases of when they had acted wrongly, had acted illegally, as the Home Secretary, a chap called William Bridgman, appears to have done. Anyway, so the costs could get quite high in this case, so the government is rushing through an indemnity bill through Parliament in order to indemnify him against costs. Also in politics, the Prime Minister, Andrew Bonar-Law, is in Paris trying to get a cure for whatever is ailing him, and the solitary elected communist Walter Newbold has been named. If you don't know what naming means, it means he's been chucked out of the House of Commons, apparently for a breach of the rules. The royal visit to Italy has ended, and there are lots of photographs in the Times of the King and Queen. There was also a big shindig during the week in honour of the Father of the House, one T.P. O'Connor. The Father of the House is the longest continually serving member of the House. T.P. O'Connor himself is an Irish nationalist. Now, competition time. Would you like to guess where he represents? Yes, that's right, Liverpool. Would you like to guess which constituency in Liverpool? Right again, Scotland. And Big Ben has been stopped for repairs. In other news, there's been a tram crash in Leeds, which has killed 6, and there's been a school fire in the United States, which has killed 70. For as long as I can remember, the National Union of Students has been an organisation espousing left-wing causes. This is not always the case. There's a little letter from a representative of the NUS in Thursday's edition, and it was all about placing French students in English homes over the vacations. There's been an announcement of a new Piccadilly Circus station. If you know Piccadilly Circus station, you know it's pretty grand. It's underground, but it's pretty grand. That is the station they're proposing. There's a new movie in the cinemas, Married Love, which is partly written by one Mary Stopes, and by the sounds of it, sounds really very worthy and very boring. It's essentially the idea that large families are poor and miserable, and small families are rich and content. And there's also been another, well, I say another because I haven't mentioned this before, but there's been another incident of counterfeiting. There's been quite a lot of this going on, and I wonder if the reason might be due to the 1920 currency. Before 1920, The silver coins were actually mostly silver, 90% silver. The silver content has now been reduced to 50%. Of course, nowadays it's zero, but that is a change that's coming in. London has long been known for its fogs. It's something that comes up in all sorts of weird and wonderful forums. I mean, for instance, it appears in Asterix in Britain, which was published in the 1960s. It appears in the film Divorce of Lady X from, I think it's 1937 or 1938. I even met a bunch of Bosnian Serbs many years ago, well, in the 1990s, who were utterly convinced that London suffered from regular fogs. The truth is that since the great fog of 1952, fog has ceased to be a problem. But in the 1920s, it was, and this has generated a couple of articles in the Times this week. A few things I picked out from this. First of all, that London suffers from, on average, about 9 or 10 serious fogs a year. It actually prevents a lot of children getting to school, which I must confess I was very surprised to hear, because I would have thought that most schools were in walking distances, and even if you couldn't see your hand in front of your face, you still had a reasonably good idea where you were going. Another issue is the grime that's produced. At the end of a fog, you'll find a lot of, grime, for want of a better word, on the roads, which actually makes driving conditions a lot worse. So what's causing this? On Thursday, the 17th, there was an editorial, and they mentioned the main causes. As you might expect, heating is a big part of it. Another is gas and electricity generation. Now, if that sounds a bit odd, that is because in those days, gas was, generated by the burning of coal. It wasn't until the 1960s that we got natural gas from the North Sea. And the third cause is industry. This may come as a surprise for some people, because you look around London and it's very difficult to find anything being made. But in those days, obviously, some things were. I mean, it's not something we tend to associate with London. London we tend to associate with things like the city and media and other industries. But obviously, industry was going on then. Almost no aspect of alcohol prohibition in the United States is working well. Americans still want to drink. Smuggling and bootlegging are rife. A trade that was once in the hands of the law-abiding is now in the hands of the criminal. The murder rate has shot up, something I covered in the 10th of December episode. The 10th of December 1922 episode. Even politicians are starting to notice. This is from Thursday, the 17th of May. In a letter to Dr. Wesley Waite, Newburgh, New York, President Harding today served a warning on state governments that a serious situation might be expected to arise if some of the states persisted in their intention to repeal their laws for the enforcement of prohibition. The 18th Amendment, he said, is the law of the land and of every state in the Union. If the federal government was compelled, through the failure of any state to discharge its proper duty with regard to prohibition, to enter upon the territory of such state and set up police and judicial establishments, the most difficult and trying situations would inevitably arise. Dr. Waite's letter, to which the President's was the answer, contained a violent criticism of the New York state authorities because of the recent passage by the state legislature of the Cavalier Bill, repealing the state's enforcement law. Every state official who voted for this bill, Dr. Waite wrote, is subject to the law of treason, having taken oath to sustain the Constitution of the United States. I could quip about New Yorkers not being great at enforcing the law, but there's a bigger point here. I was going to bet that New York State is going to fold. States have limited autonomy, a point that was established at great cost in the American Civil War, which is within living memory. But, spoiler alert, it would appear they are going to hold their nerve. How that's going to work, I do not know. Also on prohibition, I mentioned last week that the United States had declared that no ship entering US waters would be allowed to have alcohol on board. Well, a British Member of Parliament has proposed a bill as retaliation which demands that no passenger ship leaving the United Kingdom can do so without having an adequate supply of alcohol on board. On Monday the 14th, a letter from a Mr. E.A. Gurney Smith was published in the Times. No schemes for new tube railways or extensions to existing ones ought to be passed without the stipulation that they are to be of sufficient dimensions to take passenger coaches of standard loading gauge. Now, I should explain here what loading gauge is. You may have heard of track gauge. Now, track gauge is the distance between the rails. In Britain and in most of the world, that's 4 foot 8.5. The loading gauge is the dimensions of the train, so it's its height and its width. Now, when we talk about tube railways, and I should point out that there are two sorts of tube railways in London that you'll find the original cut and cover ones, which are only just below the surface and are quite large, and then you have the ones which run in tunnels which have a circular cross section, and the tunnels are pretty small, and as a consequence the trains are pretty small, and these are the really small ones that you see. He goes on, who can tell what linking up of tube railways with above ground electric railways may be found necessary in the future? Well, he has got his way in the end. We have finally opened up a tube railway, a deep level underground railway as it's known, which is of the standard loading gauge, and we opened that up within the last 5 years in stages. It's called either we call it either Crossrail or Elizabeth Line, and that is the first one. Why has it taken so long? Well, because it's really expensive. That's why. Well, I assume so. I mean, who knows? I've never looked at the books myself, but that is my assumption. In Tokyo, they've got this right, with the result that you will see there are services from companies that normally operate outside the underground network, and in the mornings, or other times of the day, they'll have three through services which use the underground sections. Clever them. When satellite television came to the United Kingdom in the early 1990s, the associated dishes came to dominate council estates. It was not so very different in the 1920s. This is from a letter from a Miss Bower of Chelsea, and it's from Monday the 14th of May. We have only to walk through the working-class streets of London and see the innumerable Marconi installations outside, yes, and inside their houses, to realise that these have been installed as often as not by schoolboys. I can only imagine this must mean that there are... Well, if you can see things from outside, the only thing I can imagine that you could see from the outside would be an aerial. So these aerials must be pretty substantial things. If there are aerials if you can put them inside, they must actually dominate the inside of these houses, I would guess. But it's interesting to see who is taking up the new technology as it was then. Also, interesting that most of the BBC's output at this point is classical music. Anyway, that's all for this week. I aim to have something up next week, but I promise nothing.